Welcome. You are now listening to our renamed podcast, Mind Power, that's me, meets Mystic, that's Cynthia over here. We are here today speaking with Deborah Kat. Deborah Kat lives a turned-on life as a pleasure CEO. She was incredibly fortunate to have been born and raised in San Francisco, surrounded by the beautiful California coastline and the alternative culture. As a founder of Deborah Kat Coaching, she leads monthly classes exploring the edges of sexuality and spirit. She combines her diverse background in Tantra, massage, and BDSM to support men and couples in clearing shame and to have satisfying relationships and better sex. She is also the host of the new podcast, the Better Sex Podcast, and the Better Sex for Couples Summit. Welcome, Deborah.
Hello there, and thank you so much for inviting me to join you today. Such an honor.
We're so excited to have you. So Michelle and I, when we were talking about inviting you to the show, we had a very simple question, which is, do you call your work a practice, a service, a craft, an art? What do you call it?
Yeah, I call it a practice, and I call it a practice because anything that you want to get good at, you need to put attention and intention on, and you need to repeat over and over again. And I know that every day is different. Even if it's the same client, even if it's the same request, I'm different, my client is different. And so that combination creates something new and exciting every time. And I think using practice gives it at least for me, there's a permission there to explore. There's a permission there not to be perfect. As a recovering control freak, perfection is, in my experience, perfection is another form of scarcity. It's like it limits us from playing and from exploring and from expansion.
Wow, I love that. I may have to change mine from art to practice.
We started talking about it and we're like, yoga is a practice. But Cynthia asked me, and I said, I think of hypnosis and executive coaching as services. Cynthia's like, what I do is an art. And I was like, ooh, I might want to be an art. Art sounds really good. But your answer about this being a practice makes perfect sense. It makes perfect sense to me. And I think it's a very, stick and real way of looking at life, right?
Yeah, so during the pandemic, my partner and I started joining so he's an Aikidoist for a million years. And we started doing an online practice with his sensei. And she really has inspired this idea of practice and coming back again and again and coming back with this new eyes. And so I really have to say that it's an inspired point of view.
Well, here's a funny thing. I was just going to say, when you talked about practice, I also do martial arts. And the quote that a lot of times we hear is, don't fear the man who knows a million kicks. Fear the man who practices one kick a million times.
Oh, yes.
So, right.
In Aikido, it's fall down 7 times, get up 8.
Love that one. Love that one too. So, way to go, my fellow martial artists. Super exciting. So, tell us how you got to this space, because you have your dominatrix, you do BDSM, you support men and couples, and then you have this lovely tantric dating service. So can you tell us, I did this, I said, chicken, egg, what came first?
Yeah, so I was super lucky. Like I said in my intro, I grew up in San Francisco. My parents were hippies and they were very experimental. And like my best friend's mother was the manager of a place called The Stud and another place called Hamburger Mary's. And so I grew up in this really alternative. My reality was that I used to go over to my bestie's house. We were like 7, and her nanny was a drag queen. And so this was what I grew up with. This is what I knew. And then when I started becoming sexual and had relationships, I met my partners at the Renaissance Fair. I should say partner, my boyfriend. And so we had this like incredible fantasy life of during the day, we'd be playing, we'd have costumes and props and roles. And that just ended up in our sex life. And then, so all of these things were possible. Like it was possible to be a washerwoman, as well as a queen, as well as everything in between. And this was my experience. And then when I got to college and stopped dating guys from the Renaissance Fair, it was like, I was a little shocked because it was like I was so far out of the box, I didn't know I was out of a box. Like I didn't know there was a box to be out of. And fortunately, all these things were ingrained in me. And then I started learning they had names. It's, spirituality and sexuality, it's a part of Tantra. And I just want to say that if that's all we think, if all we get out of Tantra is the sexual part of it, we're really missing so much. And the same side with kink and BDSM, if all we see is the place where, it's the physical experience of one person doing to another, we're really missing a lot. And so I've been really fortunate to get to have this view of seeing just the possibility of what happens when we connect our bodies and our sexuality to something bigger. And what happens when we use the body and all of these different experiences and sensual experiences into creating relationship and into creating having sexual experience. And so then that was my starting point.
That sounds fantastic. And I have to wonder if I was one of the visitors at the Renaissance Fair when you were there playing your various parts. It's an event I have always loved since I was a young person as well. I remember very well being so excited to play the game where you could shoot this sponge in a big rubber band, and if you hit one of the men, you got to kiss him. I was like,
the kissing booth.
Yeah, the kissing booth. That was probably like my favorite part of the Renaissance Fair when I was 15, 16.
And it's a really interesting place to learn about sexuality, right? Because there's a lot of boobage and a lot of cleavage. And there's all sorts of different kinds of bodies, from fuller bodied people to not so full. Men are, for the most part, coming forward with a very courtly manner. The way that men and women interacted had a very formalized way of interacting. And it was just a very interesting thing. And then you had the power dynamic of sex and class. And so it's just a very interesting place to spend a lot of time as a young person. So I just have to ask, were you at Black Point Forest or?
Yes.
Oh,
yes. Way back quite some time ago. And I've been to the Renaissance Fair since then, but it doesn't have the charm of the Black Point Forest location. Yeah. That was a very special place, a very special time.
I'm so sad.
You didn't make it, Cynthia?
I didn't get to go until I was in my 30s, early 30s. So it wasn't that long ago. And I think it was the first or second year they had moved. So I missed all the magic.
They've moved a couple times.
Okay, yeah.
And I have to say, there's definitely magic. It's just a little bit different of a flavor. And there's something about that space where sensuality is held in an honoring way, right? Like cleavage is a beautiful thing, and jokes about body jokes are acceptable and part of the game. And so I hadn't really thought about how much those pieces really affected me and allowed for that opening there.
I think you're also talking about the Renaissance Fair was really very much a place of play. And I suspect that also is part of what opened you up and part of what I saw, because to let our listeners know, I met Deborah at a Tantra speed dating event that she ran in December. And at this event, Deborah did a fantastic job of using men and women in very short moments with all kinds of unique and different activities, where you might get a great sense of who this other person was, or you might get just a glimpse of who this other person was. But it was a really fun and interesting way of connecting with, I don't know, 20 or 30 other people in a couple of hours. And I think especially after the pandemic, when we've all been alone and taught to be somewhere between cautious and afraid of each other, because who knows who's sick kind of thing. The speed dating event was just fantastic. I thought it was great, and I would recommend it to pretty much anybody who wants to get back out there and try something new.
Thank you. Yeah, I feel really honored to get to hold that space for people. And you got the new and improved version, because the first time I ran that event, it was not quite what it is today. It was really an opportunity for me to be able to learn how to hold space for a large group of people. And really, on a very personal level, Tantra Speed Date really changed my relationship. I've been with my partner for 24 years now. And when you're in a long-term relationship, there are times, if you're honest, where you're tolerating it, or it's not everything you would like it to be. And I was really at one of those points with my partner, and I hadn't even noticed it. Like, we'd been in that cycle for so long that we're just tolerating. And when I started teaching or leading Tantra Speed Date, I would get all juiced up, because really one of the secrets, I'm telling a secret here, one of the secrets of Tantra Speed Date is that when we light ourselves up, right, it's infectious. Like, when we allow ourselves to be turned on, to feel good, to feel in our bodies, what happens is I turn on, I give you permission to turn on, you give everybody else around you permission to turn on, and we end up in this place where there's a lot of really just high vibe, turned on people. And when I say turned on, I don't mean just sexually. I mean, like, the light goes on, right? And so I was getting to have that experience, to be affected and impacted by all these turned on people. And then I would take it home, and I would see my partner in his highest and best. And he really responded to that. And again, we have this cyclical connection where it's like, I'm giving him the approval, he gives me the approval, I give him more approval, and the next thing you know, there's approval all over the place. But yeah, so thank you so much I'm so glad you came, and I'm so glad and I just get to share this really yummy, juicy work. And I really want to say that, yes, it is a speed date experience, but we meet people wherever they're at. And like you said, sometimes people are showing up because they haven't been in public in a while. Sometimes they're showing up because they're looking for connection. They're trying something new. Some people are looking for their love of their life. And certainly we've had people find the love of their lives. We've had people who have found each other and created families and babies and businesses and farms and just all sorts of great stuff. And so I'm so honored to be a part of that.
I love that too. I just want to remind everybody that they are hanging out with us, Michelle Walters and me, Cynthia Varkevisser, at Mind Power Meets Mystic, and that today we're here with the incredibly lovely Deborah Kat. So, Deborah, I would love to talk to you a little bit more about your other work, your dominatrix work, your BDSM work. The reason I'm so interested is when I first heard about dominatrix work and BDSM work was about 20 years ago, and it was very hush and whisper, and literally behind a locked gate or closed doors. And it took a lot of time for me to meet people and talk with them before they would open up, because I was so curious to find out about BDSM and why people were so attracted to it. And now it's much more widely accepted. My cousin just came up to me. She's 34 years old, I think. And she says, I just did this webinar with this dominatrix, and she's talking about empowerment. And all the people of my generation are like, oh, and I was like, let's talk about this. We're going to be interviewing another dominatrix. I would love to know more. So can you tell us a little bit more about the evolution of this work and how are you seeing it become more mainstream? If mainstream's the word.
Yeah, no, I do think it's mainstream. I have a mixed bag emotion with that. When I started, it was very hush. It was very taboo. And the upside of that was that you had to know somebody and that you generally got some form of mentoring. Oftentimes we would find each other in the back of the back page. I'm like, what was the name of that? In the back page in the back of the magazine, and it would be a cryptic little note about something, and then we would meet. And the upside of this would be that like there was mentorship, there was connection, it was a very small community. If somebody new came in, it was like there was generally somebody that would advise them on who and how and what and where. And I was really lucky. I got a very old school education, meaning that I had a mentor. I was a sub for a while until I learned what it was like. And then I was like, okay, I'm ready to be a top now. I'm ready to jump into being a dom. And I was lucky. I ended up, my mentor he was military and he was very specific. And it's like, I would get one toy and I would practice it over and over again. And I would show him what I'd practiced. And then he would find somebody who wanted to play. And then I got to play on a person. And I really feel lucky to have had that experience. And on the other side, I feel like kink and BDSM can be so healing and so empowering that I am glad that it is more out in the world, and that that teachers are more willing to stand up and say, I've got some wisdom for you. And I think that there's a lot of power in surrender. There's also a lot of power in learning how to hold and create a container. And what I mean by that is that, so the container is all of the negotiation. One of the beautiful things about BDSM that I think is coming mainstream is learning how to negotiate. And when two people come together to have a scene, there's a couple things that they talk about. Who wants to play what role? What implements, what are we going to do? What are our boundaries? And then the biggest question I always ask, no matter what kind of work I'm doing, is when we're all said and done and you're walking out the door, how do you want to feel? Because it informs how I'm going to interact with you if I know what the end result is. And if I know what your limitations are, then we can play there. And also there's a way, so one of the things that's often taught in BDSM classes, it's usually one of the first things that people talk about, is safe words. And so what a safe word is, they're very shorthand communication. And for instance, like when I play with someone, when I negotiate, I use two safe words. One is mercy. Oh, I should say the reason that you want the safe words is because you want a way to communicate with somebody that is clear and you know exactly what that means. Because sometimes somebody wants to be able to say no and not have that respected, right? To be clear, that's consensual part of the scene, right? For whatever reason, like begging turns them on, or pleading turns them on, or all of these things turn them on. And so you want to use words that like fit into the scene and then are very clear that it's time to end the scene. For instance, I use the word mercy when I want somebody to let me know that this is good, but this is really at my end. I don't want you to stop, but I don't want you to go any further. So they use the word mercy, and I hear mercy and I can be like, oh, okay, so I need to slow down. I need to back off. I need to check in. And then I use the word red as something is really wrong and we need to stop in this moment. And so what that can look like is I'll stop what I'm doing. Let's say I've got them restrained or whatever. I'll reposition them in a more holding situation. And then we'll stay there until we know what to do next. Sometimes that could be continuing. Sometimes that could be just that's the end. And then I always want to have a way to reconnect. So it's like part of the conversation of negotiation is that should something happen and this doesn't go the way that we intend it to, we commit to having a repair conversation. Now, this is really important to me. Not everybody does this, but it's just part of the conversation. But as long as I'm talking about the different stages of a scene, so you start with negotiation, and it usually is about who's doing what, what's going to happen, how long it's going to happen for, and then how are you going to end things, right? Aftercare is very important. And aftercare means that we've come to the end of the agreed scene, but then we need to come back into put ourselves back in our boxes, if you will. It's like back in the can, as one of my teachers likes to say. And so how do we do that? And there's different ways to do that. It may be holding, some at times it may be conversation, sometimes it may be food, drink, whatever that is. The other thing I just want to say is that I think it's really important in this kind of play to do it with a clear mind. I have definitely played with people they want to be like gotten drunk or gotten being drugged, and we've played with that, but it's always been like very well held and negotiated. But I would think twice about playing with somebody who just out of the blue shows up and was intoxicated.
Really interesting. It's really interesting. And I think it's really, I'm not sure quite how to say it, but to think about how you're creating what your word was, a container, right? So it's like an opportunity to live life outside of your regular life. And we all have such busy lives and we all live such frazzled existences. I can see how having an opportunity to do something like that, something completely out of the norm, would be really helpful for people.
Yeah. And I think that having parameters and having boundaries allows for freedom. I know this sounds counterintuitive, but I believe that I can find more freedom in a 3x3 space than I can if there's no containment. And for me, it's what happens is that it just becomes more and more potent. And if there's no boundaries, I just dissipate, if that makes any sense.
No, it makes a lot of sense. I was the first person that actually opened up to me about BDSM, spoke very lovingly about their person, their top, because what they said is it gave them a space. Surrender is the beautiful word. And what they said is that they actually found relief, that they could stay present in body, and they worked out a lot of trust issues this way because they weren't always in their head and second guessing, and they're very much intellectual in their head anyway. So it was really nice and grounding for them to have that time, and was very grateful. And
Talking to one of the things I practice is something called bondage, and it is bondage, massage, and sensory deprivation. And sensory deprivation is like you put on headphones so that your hearing is controlled, and you've got a blindfold, so there's essentially you're out of your head. And so my friend and mentor Jaylene and I were just talking about bondage, and we were talking about that. We were talking about like how this practice, especially with couples, can help them to establish trust. It can help them to expand their, what they know about each other, because what we say about ourselves and what our bodies do can sometimes be different things. And when you learn how to pay attention to your partner's body, and when you learn how to notice the subtle difference between like their toes curling or their breath changing, or all of a sudden they were wiggling around and all of a sudden there's like the deep breath and that release into surrender. And it's just exquisite. And to either side of that, like I am really fortunate. Like I am very comfortable being in charge, and I am really comfortable with the right person, surrendering and having that experience of being able to feel my body in those different experiences, and being able to trust somebody and being able to allow myself the luxury of giving up control is exquisite, just exquisite.
So now I just want to put it all together because I'm all about spirituality. There's so much spirituality in what you're talking about, the cyclical way of how you're working with people, that you start with negotiations and you end with a really lovely closure so that there's a complete experience, that there's integrity in all that you do. So I would love to know, how does spirit play in your work? Because I know it does, personally as well as for others. And then I have one more that is completely opposite of that, which is, how in the hell did you go from Aikido, Tantra, BDSM, and then dating, the dating service?
Yeah, first of all, I feel like my spirituality is very much connected to nature, and it's very much connected to the seasons and things that nature's a continuum, right? There's no separation, right? You've got the things that are composting and you've got the things that are growing, and those two ends need each other. And I really feel at some point, I just realized that I was connected to everything and everybody. And that's really what I consider to be my spirituality. It's like, what is my connection? Who am I connected to? Where am I connected? And what is my impact? And how am I being impacted? And I think, going back to BDSM for just a moment, when we do something to another body, whether it's touching it, whether it's spanking it, whether it's scratching it, whether it's pinching it, we are having an impact. And what happens is that experience, the person takes that experience in, and then there's a circuit that goes out. Like there's a way in which I impact them and they impact me. And it's really funny because I wouldn't necessarily consider myself to be a spiritual being. But as I'm talking, I'm like, oh, yeah, I guess I am kind of spiritual. And I think for a while, I was just going through the motions of spirituality. And then I started realizing, oh, it's everything. It's everywhere. And with BDSM, one of the things I want to say is that whether you are on the top or the dominant side of things, or whether you are the submissive or on the bottom side of things, not only are you impacting each other, but there's a way in which I believe that when I surrender, I'm surrendering to the person in front of me, but I'm also surrendering to something bigger, right? Because a lot of times what I'm coming up against is some version of my own patterning, right? And to move forward in the world, like we're not in these bodies for that long. And so my intention is to experience everything that's possible in this body. And so allowing for that expansion, whether it be in what I perceive to be possible or what I feel to be possible, like there has to be something where I allow something bigger to take control. And so, yeah. That, I'm not sure if I answered the question, but there you go.
I think you did a great job answering the connection. And it's funny because our show used to be called It's All Connected. And it sounds like that's at the core a lot of where you're at. So speaking of connections, Deborah, we're going to wrap up our show. How can our listeners get in touch with you? And what do you have coming up that they should know about?
Thank you for asking. So coming up, I have the Better Sex for Couples Summit. This is a free 3-day event. I've got about 12 different experts. We're having these amazing discussions about all sorts of different things around sex and communication, sex and empowerment, sex and pleasure. And you can find out about that at bettersexforcouplessummit.com. And you can get a hold of me personally at deborahkat.com, and it's DEBORAH, and it's KAT.com. And other than that, I've got more Tantra speed date, and I think that's the highlight. But I'm super excited about the summit. It's so like the information that we get about sex and relationships sucks. Like it just does. And I'm so happy to be able to bring people together to really expand what's possible there.
Love it. Thank you so much for being on Mind Power Meets Mystic.
My pleasure. Thank you so much for having me. This has been a really lovely conversation, and I really appreciate the questions. And yeah, so it feels really good to be here with both of you.
Bye-bye.